Gifted black boy asks famous millionaire to play piano at party. His response is unexpected. "Are you sure that this child should be here?" whispered Veronica Sinclair to the event organizer, discreetly pointing to the 8-year-old boy who was staring in fascination at the Steinway grand piano in the center of the hall. The Sinclair Foundation's annual charity gala brought together the city's elite in the city's most expensive penthouse. Tech tycoons, celebrities, and politicians mingled among works of art that cost more than entire houses, while waiters served champagne worth $1,000 a bottle. Ethan Miller was only there because his father, David, was working as the catering supervisor for the event. The boy had begged to accompany his father, promising to stay quietly in a corner, but his eyes couldn't stray from the magnificent instrument that dominated the room. "Dad, look at that piano," Ethan whispered, discreetly tugging at David's uniform sleeve. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." David looked around nervously, noticing a few curious glances turning toward them. "Ethan, remember what we talked about? You need to stay quiet and invisible, okay? This job is very important to us." What neither of them could have imagined was that Adrian Sinclair, the billionaire host of the party, had noticed the boy's fixation on the piano from the moment he entered the hall. At 55, he had built a tech empire based on innovation and tradition, values he proudly upheld. David called the catering coordinator, motioning for him to come closer. "Mr. Sinclair wants to talk to you. Now." David's heart raced. In 10 years of organizing elite events, he knew that when the host wanted to talk to an employee during the party, it was rarely good news. Ethan watched his father walk away and turned his attention back to the piano. Without realizing it, he began to slowly approach the instrument as if drawn by a magnetic force. His small, delicate fingers almost touched the keys when a deep voice cut through the air behind him. "And you think you can play that, little boy?" Ethan turned and found Adrian Sinclair standing a few feet away, his imposing posture and condescending smile making him feel even smaller. Around them, some conversations quieted. Curious people began to pay attention to the situation. I was just looking, sir," Ethan replied, his voice almost a whisper. "Looking?" Adrian laughed, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Child, this piano is worth more than the house you live in. It's not a toy." The remark provoked discreet giggles from some of the nearby guests. Ethan felt his cheeks grow hot, but something in his eyes showed no shame. It was determination. "I can play," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Can I show you?" The silence that followed was almost palpable. Adrian Sinclair raised an eyebrow, genuinely amused by the boy's audacity. In the distance, David watched in horror, knowing that his son had just crossed a dangerous line. "You know how to play?" Adrian repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And where exactly would a boy like you learn classical piano?" There, under the weight of dozens of condescending glances and mocking smiles, Ethan stood firm, guarding a secret too powerful to be revealed before the time was right. His eyes sparkled with a confidence that didn't match his 8 years of age, as if he knew something that all those rich adults could never imagine. If you've ever been underestimated because of your appearance or background, then you know that sometimes it takes more than words to prove your worth. Subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple question from a child would turn a night of prejudice into a moment no one would ever forget. Adrian Sinclair laughed loudly, a sound that echoed through the hall and made several heads turn. "Where would you learn classical piano?" he repeated, gesturing theatrically. "On YouTube? On some mobile app?" Laughter spread among the nearby guests. A socialite whispered something to her friend, both looking at Ethan with expressions of pity mixed with amusement. "Adrian, dear," said Veronica Sinclair, approaching with a glass of champagne in her hand. "Why are you wasting your time with this? We have important investors waiting to talk to you." But Adrian was clearly enjoying himself. No, I want to hear it. Tell us all, little one. Where exactly would a boy in your situation learn classical piano?" Ethan felt all the words he wanted to say catch in his throat. How could he explain that 3 years ago, when his father worked cleaning offices at night, he had discovered an abandoned piano in the basement of a commercial building? How could he tell them that he spent hours practicing in silence wearing headphones connected to the electric keyboard his father had bought used for $50? "My teacher taught me," he finally replied, his voice small but firm. "Teacher?" Adrian raised an eyebrow. "And where does this teacher teach? At your neighborhood public school?" The comment provoked more giggles. Ethan lowered his eyes, remembering Mr. Robert Sterling, the retired pianist who lived in the apartment next door. 3 nights a week, after David came home exhausted from work, the 72-year-old man would open his door to Ethan and his little digital keyboard. "You don't understand," Ethan muttered more to himself than to Adrian. "Don't understand what?" Adrian crouched down, bringing himself to his height with a patronizing smile. "Listen, little one, this piano," he tapped the polished wood lightly, "is a 1942 Steinway. It's worth over $500,000. Great pianists have played on it. You really think you can just come in here and—" "Adrian!" David's voice cut through the air like a knife. He had approached silently, his face pale but controlled. "Ethan, come here." "Ah, the father." Adrian straightened up, his smile becoming even more condescending. "David, isn't it? We need to have a talk about boundaries and proper supervision." David placed his hand protectively on Ethan's shoulder. "I apologize, Mr. Sinclair." Ethan was just impressed by the piano. He didn't mean any disrespect. "Disrespect?" Adrian laughed. "Oh, it's not disrespect. It's just realism. Some people are born into one world, others are born into another. It's important that everyone knows their place." Ethan felt his father's hand tighten on his shoulder. He knew that touch. It was David trying to control himself, trying not to explode in front of the boss who paid the bills. "Of course, sir," David replied, his voice tense. "We understand perfectly." "Great." Adrian waved his hand as if dismissing a pet. "Now, how about we get back to the party? I'm sure there's work to be done in the kitchen." It was at that moment that something changed in Ethan's eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, more determined. He looked at the piano, then at Adrian, then at the dozens of faces around him watching him with curiosity or contempt. "May I ask you a question, sir?" Ethan said, his voice clear and calm. Adrian paused, clearly surprised by the change in tone. "Of course, little one. Do you know how to play that piano that's worth $500,000? The question caught Adrian off guard. He blinked a few times, glanced around at the guests who were now paying close attention to the conversation, and then laughed nervously. "I appreciate music, obviously. I have a classical education. I studied at—" "But can you play it?" Ethan insisted, his voice still calm, but now with an intensity that made some of the adults shift uncomfortably. Adrian opened and closed his mouth, clearly annoyed at being questioned by an 8-year-old in front of his guests. "It's not about knowing how to play, little boy. It's about understanding, about having the proper education, about—" "So you don't?" Ethan interrupted softly. "But you're sure I don't?" An awkward silence fell over the group. David closed his eyes, knowing his son had crossed a dangerous line. Adrian turned red, unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by a child. "Ethan," David whispered urgently, "stop." But Ethan didn't stop. He walked over to the piano, his small hands reverently touching the keys. "Mr. Sterling always says that music doesn't care where you come from. It only cares if you really feel it." Adrian regained his composure, his voice now laden with irritation. "All right, very well. If you insist," he gestured dramatically toward the piano, "go ahead. Show us your great talent." The challenge was on. Ethan looked at the keys, then at his father, who shook his head almost imperceptibly, then at Adrian, who watched him with a cruel smile on his lips. "But," Adrian added, his voice loud enough to attract even more attention, "when you can't play anything but chopsticks, I want you and your father to remember this conversation about knowing your place." There, surrounded by dozens of wealthy adults who saw him as entertainment, Ethan placed his hands on the keys. His fingers trembled slightly, but not from fear. They trembled the same way a guitar string trembles before producing a perfect note. Each humiliation only fueled something inside him that those privileged adults couldn't see, a quiet determination being forged by the very injustice they tried to impose on him. What they didn't know was that every word of contempt was writing a lesson they would never forget. The first notes came out of the keys like crystal drops falling into still water. Ethan started with something simple, Debussy's Clair de Lune. But there was something about the way he played that made the entire hall fall silent. Adrian had expected a disastrous attempt at Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, or perhaps a few poorly executed chords that would confirm his worldview. Instead, Ethan's small fingers danced across the keys with a precision that defied his age and background. "My God," whispered someone in the crowd. David watched, petrified, his hands clenched against his chest. He knew Ethan was talented, but he had never seen him play on a real piano, on a Steinway that cost more than his house. Adrian frowned, clearly annoyed. This wasn't going according to the script he had imagined. "It's a simple song," he said loud enough to be heard. "Any child who has had a few lessons can play that." Ethan stopped in the middle of the piece and looked up at him. "You're right," he said calmly. "This one is easy." Without warning, he began something completely different. The notes of Liszt's La Campanella filled the air, one of the most technically challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. His fingers flew across the keys at impossible speeds, every note crystal clear and perfect. The crowd gasped. Even professional musicians struggle with that composition. To see an 8-year-old execute it with such mastery was simply surreal. "That's impossible," Adrian muttered more to himself than to anyone else. That's when a voice cut through the air from across the hall. "Actually, it's quite impressive." Everyone turned to see a gray-haired man approaching. It was Dr. Catherine Vance, the city's most respected music critic and the party's special guest. His articles in the New York Times could make or break musical careers. "Dr. Vance," Adrian quickly regained his composure. "I didn't know you had arrived." Catherine ignored Adrian completely, walking straight to the piano where Ethan was still playing. "Where did you learn Liszt, young man?" Ethan finished the current passage before answering. "My teacher, Mr. Sterling. He said that if I could play Liszt, I could play anything." "Mr. Sterling," Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Robert Sterling?" "Yes, sir. Do you know him?" Catherine laughed, a genuine sound of pleasure. "Do I know him? Little boy, Robert Sterling was the principal pianist of the New York Philharmonic for 15 years. He's a legend." The silence that followed was awkward for Adrian. David felt his legs tremble. He hadn't known that the kind neighbor who taught Ethan for free had such credentials. Robert never mentioned he was teaching anyone. Catherine continued studying Ethan with renewed interest. "He retired 5 years ago and turned down dozens of students from the musical elite. Why did he choose you?" Ethan thought for a moment. He said, "I had musical hunger, that it wasn't about having money to pay for expensive lessons, but about feeling the music here." He tapped his chest. "Really?" Adrian tried to regain control of the situation. "Dr. Vance, surely you're not suggesting that this child has more musical talent in his little finger than most Juilliard students," Catherine interrupted. "That's exactly what I'm suggesting." The tension in the room was palpable. Adrian felt his control of the situation slipping through his fingers like sand. Talent is one thing, but formal education, cultural refinement, proper exposure. "Adrian," Catherine turned to him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "May I ask a question? How many times have you played this $500,000 piano in the last 12 months? Adrian opened and closed his mouth. Well, I've been busy with business." While this young man, Catherine gestured to Ethan, practices 3 hours a night on a $50 digital keyboard and can play Liszt with the precision of a professional. David felt tears sting his eyes. He didn't know anyone had noticed Ethan's dedication. The nights he practiced silently with headphones on so as not to wake the neighbors. Ethan looked at Catherine, then at Adrian, then at his father. "Can I play another song, please?" Catherine said, making an elegant gesture. "No," Adrian interjected sharply. "I think that's enough spectacle for one night." The comment was like a slap in the face. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ethan lowered his eyes, finally showing his age. That's when Catherine did something unexpected. He sat down next to Ethan on the piano bench. "How about we play together? Do you know Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2? Ethan's eyes lit up. "Four hands?" "Four hands." They began to play together, Catherine taking the lower part while Ethan led the main melody. The music was complex, dramatic, full of changes in rhythm and dynamics that required perfect synchrony between the musicians. But they played as if they had been partners for years. Ethan anticipated Catherine's changes. He followed her interpretive variations. It was a musical conversation of professional caliber. When they finished, the applause was deafening. Not the polite applause of before, but a genuinely emotional ovation. People wiped away tears. Others shouted, "Bravo." Adrian was pale, realizing that he had completely lost control of the situation. His charity event had turned into an unauthorized recital starring a child he had tried to humiliate. Catherine stood up and held out a card to David, who had approached hesitantly. "Mr. Miller, I'd like to talk to you about your son's educational options. I know of some programs." "He's not going anywhere," Adrian interrupted, his voice heavy with irritation. "This is my party, my house, and I decide." "Decide what, exactly?" Catherine turned to him, her voice dangerously calm. "Whether a child with exceptional talent should be given opportunities. Whether musical merit should be determined by zip code." The entire room watched the confrontation. Adrian felt dozens of eyes on him, including some of his biggest investors and business partners. "That's not what this is about. It's about order, structure, maintaining certain—" "Certain what, Adrian?" Catherine's voice echoed through the silent hall. "Finish the sentence." Adrian realized he had walked himself into a trap. Any words he chose now would make him look exactly what he was. A rich man who believed that talent and opportunity should be determined by birth, not merit. Ethan watched silently, his hands still resting gently on the keys. At 8 years old, he was witnessing a lesson in power, privilege, and how people reveal who they truly are when they feel threatened. At that moment, while Adrian struggled to find words that wouldn't condemn him in front of his own guests, something extraordinary was happening. Ethan was no longer just a black boy asking to play the piano. He had become the catalyst for a conversation that these privileged people had spent their entire lives avoiding. But what they didn't know was that this was only the first note of a symphony of change that was about to echo far beyond the walls of that penthouse. Adrian was cornered, and he knew it. His face drained of color when he realized that half of his most important guests were filming Ethan's performance on their cell phones. Worse still, some had already posted on social media with glowing comments about the young gifted discovered at the Sinclair party. "Adrian," Catherine said, her voice cutting through the tense silence that followed the applause. "I need to tell you something interesting. You know, I've been a music critic for 25 years, right?" Adrian nodded nervously, not liking the tone of the conversation. "In all those years, I've seen talent wasted because of prejudice. I've seen opportunities denied because of arrogance. But never," Catherine paused dramatically, "never have I witnessed someone try to humiliate a child with exceptional talent in front of 200 people." A murmur ran through the room. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others whispered among themselves. "Mr. Miller," Catherine addressed David, who was still visibly shaken, "your son just performed Liszt with the technical precision of a conservatory graduate. How old is he exactly?" 8 years old, sir," David replied, his voice trembling with emotion. 8 years old, Catherine repeated, looking directly at Adrian. "And you thought it was appropriate to publicly question whether he knew his place?" Adrian tried to recover. "Listen, Catherine, you're taking this out of context. Let me contextualize." A woman's voice cut through the air. It was Isabella Chen, editor-in-chief of Cultural Elite magazine and one of the most influential guests at the party. "Adrian, I have this all recorded on my phone. You literally said that some people are born into one world and others into another, and that everyone should know their place. Adrian felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Isabella Chen had the power to destroy reputations with a single article. What's more, Isabella continued, holding up her phone, I posted a video of Ethan's performance on my Instagram 5 minutes ago. It already has 0 views, and the comments are enlightening about the host's behavior. David held Ethan's hand tighter, still processing how the situation had completely reversed. His son had gone from the target of humiliation to the center of admiration in a matter of minutes. Adrian, said Mark Thorne, one of Adrian's biggest investors in tech, I need to talk to you in private, now. Adrian knew that tone meant serious trouble. Thorne represented a group of investors who valued the public reputation of their partners extremely highly. Ethan. Catherine knelt down to the boy's height. I'd like to do something special. How about we play one last song together? Something that shows all these people here what real music is. Ethan looked at his father, who nodded with tears in his eyes. Do you know Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue? Catherine asked. Ethan's eyes lit up. That's one of my favorites. They took their places at the piano again. This time, there was no side conversation, no distractions. 200 people watched in absolute silence. The music that came out of that piano was pure magic. Ethan played with a passion that transcended his age. Each note was loaded with emotion, history, pure talent that couldn't be bought or inherited. Catherine accompanied him perfectly, but she made it clear that he was the star. When they finished, the silence lasted for long seconds before exploding into emotional applause. People were crying openly. Some shouted, "Bravo!" in multiple languages. Adrian watched it all with a mixture of horror and fascination. His party had become completely about Ethan, and there was nothing he could do to regain control. Adrian, Isabella Chen approached him, still recording with her cell phone. Would you like to comment on this young man's exceptional talent? Perhaps a public retraction? Before he could respond, Catherine stood up and made an announcement that would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to announce that on behalf of the New York Conservatory of Music, I am offering a full scholarship to Ethan Miller, including housing for him and his father, and every educational opportunity his exceptional talent deserves. The hall erupted in even louder applause. David collapsed in tears, hugging Catherine, then Ethan, then anyone nearby. Adrian stood in the middle of his own hall, watching as his attempt to humiliate a child had turned into the most important moment of his life. All around, his guests filmed, posted, celebrated, all focused on Ethan and his victory. His phone began to vibrate incessantly. Instagram notifications, text messages, emails. The story was spreading across the internet at a frightening speed, and he wasn't the hero of the narrative. Mark Thorne approached him again. Adrian, our group of investors has decided to reconsider our partnership. We can't be associated with this kind of behavior. There, at the center of his own social empire, Adrian Sinclair watched his reputation crumble note by note. While an 8-year-old boy he had tried to belittle became the most talked-about musical sensation in town. As cell phone flashes captured every moment of Ethan's rise, one question hung in the air. Could a simple piano performance rewrite not only the fate of a child, but expose the deep cracks in a world that had always pretended that merit and birth were one and the same? 6 months later, the video of Ethan playing La Campanella in the Sinclair penthouse had surpassed 2 million views on YouTube. The video's title, 8-year-old boy humiliates prejudiced billionaire with extraordinary talent, had gone viral in dozens of languages. Ethan now lived in a comfortable apartment near the New York Conservatory of Music, where he studied full-time. David had quit his catering job to devote himself completely to his son's education, thanks to a full scholarship that covered all their needs. "Dad, look," Ethan shouted, running across the living room with an envelope in his hands. "Carnegie Hall wants me to play at the Young Talent concert." David smiled, hugging his son. 6 months ago, they had barely enough money to pay the rent. Now, Ethan was being sought after by the best concert halls in the country. Dr. Catherine Vance had kept all her promises. In addition to the scholarship at the conservatory, she had connected Ethan with the best teachers in the city and arranged performances that established his reputation as one of the most promising young pianists of his generation. "Ethan has a gift that transcends technique," she said in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine. "In 40 years of music criticism, I have rarely seen such pure and genuine talent. He doesn't just play music, he tells stories that touch the soul." Meanwhile, Adrian Sinclair watched his life fall apart piece by piece. The viral video had sparked a series of journalistic investigations into his business practices. Isabella Chen had published a devastating article in Cultural Elite entitled "The True Face of the Elite: How Prejudice Rules the Halls of Manhattan." 3 of his biggest investors had withdrawn their capital from his projects. Mark Thorne not only canceled the $200 million partnership, but also influenced other investors to avoid any association with Adrian. Veronica Sinclair had filed for divorce, taking half the assets and moving to the Hamptons. "I can no longer be associated with this kind of behavior," she told the New York Post. "It does not represent the values I want for my family." The penthouse where it all happened was now up for sale, with Adrian desperately trying to liquidate assets to cover his mounting debts. His attempts to control the damage to his reputation only made matters worse, especially when a journalist discovered that he had graduated from a prestigious university without ever learning to play the piano he valued so highly as a status symbol. "It's ironic," Catherine commented on her weekly classical music podcast. "A man who owned a $500,000 Steinway never learned to play a single note while a boy with a $50 keyboard was mastering Liszt." David watched Ethan practice on his new Yamaha piano, a gift from Catherine. The boy played Rhapsody in Blue with a musical maturity that impressed even the most experienced teachers at the conservatory. "Ethan," David called during a break, "do you remember that night in the penthouse?" Ethan stopped playing and smiled. "I do. That's when I learned that some people confuse money with talent, social status with real value." "And what else did you learn?" "That music doesn't lie," Ethan replied, his words carrying a wisdom beyond his 8 years. "When you really play with your heart, it doesn't matter where you came from or how much money your parents have. Music shows who you really are inside." 6 months after the night that changed their lives, Ethan took the stage at Carnegie Hall for his first solo performance. In the audience, David cried with pride, sitting next to Catherine and Mr. Robert Sterling, who had flown in from Los Angeles especially for the concert. Across town, Adrian watched the live webcast in his rented apartment in Queens, where he had moved after losing his penthouse. His empire had crumbled, his friends had abandoned him, and his arrogance had turned to bitter regret. On the screen, he watched Ethan receive a standing ovation from 3,000 people. The same boy he had tried to humiliate was now being applauded by New York's cultural elite, many of whom had been present on that fateful night. When the first notes of La Campanella filled Carnegie Hall, Adrian closed his laptop and rested his head in his hands. He had lost everything, trying to prove that talent depended on birth and privilege. Ethan had proven that true excellence knows no social boundaries. The lesson was crystal clear. Adrian tried to diminish Ethan, but ended up diminishing only himself. Ethan learned that true success doesn't come from proving you're better than your detractors, but from becoming so extraordinary that they become irrelevant. Years later, when Ethan would become one of the most respected pianists in the world, people would still ask him about that night that transformed him from an unknown boy into an international sensation. His answer was always the same. "It wasn't the music that changed my life. It was discovering that true strength comes from never letting anyone define your limits." If this story of overcoming adversity touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that prove that true talent always finds a way, no matter what obstacles try to block it.